Alright, so we're going to add some parameters to this shelf. So I'll go to the reference plans and create a dimension. So I'm going to annotate a line dimension that goes from the two reference planes. We'll do it again in the other direction. And this will become the shelf width. I'm going to change this to shelf unit width because we might need another parameter later on just for the shelf that we use as a nested object, and this will be a type parameter. And then we'll change this to say shelf unit depth. That will also be a type parameter. And then if I go to the front view and create another dimension, I want to set that to shelf unit height as a type parameter as well. So these are all funky dimensions right now because I didn't really pay much attention to where I put those reference planes. So I'm going to correct that right now by going into my type families. But before I do that, I'll go to a 3D view so I can see what happens as I make these changes. Go into the family types, and I'm going to change those values here. So if we look at shelf unit depth, that should be set to 1 foot. And I'm looking to see, did that shelf unit adjust as I did that? And it did. Shelf unit height will set to 5 feet is a good start point, I think. I'm going to hit apply, and I want to see that the inside rectangle is staying intact. It is in this example. And then shelf unit width, I'm going to set that to 3 feet and apply. And that looks pretty good. Now I could create a type parameter right now so that I don't have to redo those values every single time. So I'm going to create a new type, and I'm going to name it, let's go ahead and put the depth of the shelf first, so 12 inches, by width for, next 36 inches, by height last 60 inches. It's a good idea to keep your formats the same way so that when you're reading your shelf sizes you can see them, you can read them and know that they're in that order, depth, width, and then height. So we'll hit OK, and now I have a type I can go back to. So I'm going to create one other type that changes the height and width at least. So I'm going to create a new type, and start off with 12 inches by, let's change the width to 48 inches, and we'll change the height to 48 inches. Now I can go in, because this is the type, I should make sure that the actual height and width match my type here. So this should remain 1 foot, but my unit height and width should change to 4 feet and 4 feet to match that type. And my shelf unit went along with it, so things are looking really good so far. So I'm going to hit OK, and we're going to create a new family that will live outside of this family, and then we'll nest that family into this one. So I'm going to start a new, well, let's go ahead and save what we have so far. So this is called family 1. I'm going to save this into my families folders. So you would save this into your families folders that you set up in the beginning of the semester. I'm going to put it under furniture, and I'm going to create a new folder just to make this not be so confusing. You don't necessarily have to do this, called shelf unit. So open that folder, and then this is going to be called shelf unit, and then I'll add my initials to it, which is usually the instructions I give you for submitting or uploading the projects for grading. So we'll hit save, and now we have this saved, and we're going to be able to tell the difference between these families as we work with them. To clean this up a little bit too, I'm going to close down everything but this one view. So I'll go to the View tab, and then just turn on or hit close inactive. And that's the view of the original shelf I showed you, so I'll close that one too. And now I'm ready to create a new family that I'll be able to tell which file I'm in by reading here and seeing the tab that I'm working with. So let's start a new family, and this will also be a furniture family. And in this one I'm going to create the same kind of reference planes. So this will be shelf width, shelf depth, and I do need to create a shelf height. So go to front and create another reference plane. Notice how low I am to the 0 reference reference plane of 0 representing the floor. That's because this shelf's going to be embedded in another family, and the floor, if you will, is going to be whatever height or elevation I decide to set the shelf to, and I want it relative to that 0 finished floor height. So this will be shelf height. So the shelf thickness will probably be 3/4 of an inch. And we're going to have to set some parameters. I think instead of setting a parameter for height for the shelf, I'm going to make that a fixed value. So I will put in a dimension and just go from the reference planes and then lock that dimension. That's going to lock those reference planes, and when we attach our extruded solid to those reference planes, they'll remain at that 3/4 of an inch thick. In the reference level, however, I want the width and depth to work with the shelving unit that we created. So I'm going to create 2 new annotation dimensions. And this parameter is going to be set to shelf width, not shelf unit width. Big difference. That's also going to stay a type. And then we're going to set this to shelf depth, not shelf unit depth. Again, that's important to make sure those are 2 different types of names. And then I'm just going to go into my families types and set these to some normal values. We'll start off with 1 foot and 3 feet, and then hit OK. Alright, so now we're ready to create the actual shelf. So I'm just going to use the Create Panel extrusion and use the rectangle tool and draw that rectangle inside the reference planes, making sure to lock them to the reference planes, and then hit the green checkbox. I'll then have to go to that front view and check to see the extrusion. Of course, this is set to a default of 1 foot. I don't want it to do that, however. I want that to be locked to the reference plane I created for the height. So we'll lock that. And now I think this this shelf here is ready to go. It's ready to be used as a nested entity within this shelf unit. So I've got to save it first. So I'm going to do a File Save As again. And in here, in the same folder that I have for shelf unit, we have shelf unit. I also want to create individual shelf, and we'll add my initials to the end of it. So I have an individual shelf in the shelf unit. Hit save. And then I really want this to be used inside this project. So I've got to load it into this project here. Now these are the other views of that same shelf that we just created. I can close those if I want to make it less confusing. So I'm going to keep reference level and 3D view open. And we can see that we're in the individual shelf file here. Here we're in the shelf unit file. So I want to be in the individual shelf file. And then I want to use load into project. And the only other project that's open is this shelf project. So we're just going to place the shelf in there. Don't worry too much about its location yet. And then we'll use the reference level to position this correctly. So I basically want the front of that shelf always to be locked to this front face. So I'm going to use the Align tool, and I'll use the reference line for the center front back reference, and then take the front edge of that shelf and lock it. So that aligns it this way. And then in order to get this to align inside, I actually want it to be aligned to this inside edge, or I can put a constraint dimension on here that positions this shelf so it's just to the inside, or 3/4 of an inch in on either side from the shelf unit width. So I'm going to add a dimension that goes from this reference line to the edge of the shelf, and then I'm going to select the shelf so it activates that dimension and put in a distance of 0.75 inches. And that should be exactly the right spot so that the shelf on the left here is going to be locked or constrained to stay with that dimension. Now the problem is the shelf width isn't correct, and I also have a separate embedded, if you will, parameter for the shelf depth. I want the shelf depth and width to be controlled by the shelf unit depth and the shelf unit width that's already in this this setting. So what I'm going to do is create a little formula, and this is how it works. We go into the properties, and I know that shelf unit height and shelf unit width are set to 4 feet. The width of the individual shelf should be 4 feet minus essentially 1.5 inches, because we're subtracting 3/4 of an inch on both sides. So that's important to take note. And then also take note of how I wrote out the names of these parameters, because we're going to use them as a formula. So in order to use the formula within the nested family, I'm going to select the nested family and go into Edit Type, and then across from Shelf Depth I can set this to a formula. So I can say make this shelf unit depth, and make this shelf unit width, and that is one way to control the parameter. So if I hit apply and OK, the problem is the shelf is actually wider than it's supposed to be, because it is been set to constrain to 3/4 of an inch in, so it's sticking out 1.5 inches in this direction. If I go into the shelf and edit type and change those parameters, I should be able to let's set it to none. Let's just test this. I should be able to set this up as a formula and put in a value, but I'm noticing I'm not getting the chance to put in those parameters from the other file. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to actually try it from a different angle. So we're going to keep that as saying, actually I'm going to set these back to what they were before. So I'm just going to set them both to none, and we're going to come at it at a different angle. So we'll hit apply here and OK, and now the shelf is its own independent size. And I'm going to go in and create some new parameters. And these are going to be named the same names as the shelf width and depth of the nested family. So I'm going to create a new parameter by going down here, new parameter, and this will be a type parameter. This one I will call shelf depth as an instance, and we'll create another one called shelf width, also as a type rather. I said instance before and I meant type. And then we're going to put formulas across from them. So in this shelf depth is going to be equal to shelf unit depth minus 1.5 inches. Okay, so see how that set that shelf depth to the 10.5 inches for depth. You know what? I'm going to make another correction here because we haven't done the back panel of this shelving unit. I'm going to make that minus 3/4 of an inch because we actually only need to subtract 3/4 from depth. It's the width that we have to subtract 1.5. So this is going to become shelf unit, whoops, wrong one, down here. There we go. Shelf unit width minus 1.5 inches. And that should be the correct width for the shelf if we set it to this size. And that's how this is going to work. So if I hit OK here, because I've added these two new parameters and they're the same names as the ones that I'm going to be using for the nested shelf, this should work. So when you hit OK, I'm now going to select that nested shelf again, go into Edit Type, and change the shelf depth parameter to shelf depth, which is the one that's in this file, not the nested parameter. That's perfect. We want that to say 11.25, and then I want to take the shelf width and do the same thing. Select the shelf width that's inside this family parameter, and then that sets that to the correct dimension. Now our shelf is fitting inside our shelving unit. If we go to the 3D view, it's just hanging out at the bottom. So I want to give that an offset of 1 foot maybe, or 1'4" and that puts that so that the distance between the top of the shelf and this bottom edge of the lowest part of the shelving unit is about 1 foot. So that's how we can control a nested family within the shelving unit. In the next video, I'll show you how to array it and then get control of that array so that we can actually have the array shelf work with the shelf height.